So today we are going to continue on our children's dress. We're going to be doing the bias binding on the neckline and then also starting to prepare our little ruffles that will be in place of sleeves on our garment. So let's go ahead and switch over to our other camera and we'll get started. Okay, over here I've got my little bodice that we did last week. So at this point, you should have your buttonholes stitched on the back and then shoulders and side seams both stitched. So today we're going to prepare our bias strip that will finish that neck edge. And then, like I said, we'll move on to the sleeves. So I'll go ahead and set this aside for now. And I'm gonna grab out my bias strip. So this is the pattern piece that we're working with today. This is your bias binding. You were just supposed to cut one of these, and this is on the bias. So that grain line should go parallel to your selvage, and your pattern piece should have been on the diagonal. So I've got one of those here, and we're gonna start prepping this very similarly to the way that we did our bound seam finish in our notebook. But the one difference is we're gonna add in an extra step. So on our bound seam finish, we left our raw edges, these short edges, raw, because on a seam, those usually get crossed by another seam. And so that little end ends up getting swallowed by a seam allowance. But in this case, those edges are going to be visible, so we need to fold them in. So the first thing we're gonna do is fold that in, and I'm looking at the wrong side of my fabric, so this is the back of my fabric. Fold it in 1/4 inch, and we'll press that. On both sides. Okay, and then we're going to prepare it just like we did our bound. So the first thing we're gonna do is fold this wrong sides together in half and create that center crease. Like we said, this strip is on the bias, which has the most amount of stretch of your fabric. So as you're going, you want to try not to tug and pull on your strip. You don't want to stretch it out. And you also don't want to rub your iron down the length of it. So every time you move, pick up your iron and scoot it over to prevent stretching. Okay, next we're going to open that up and we're gonna fold both of these raw edges into that center and press. So I'm gonna work on one side at a time. Fold that into the center crease and press. Let this sit here for a second so it'll set that crease in. And again, if yours keeps popping up on you, we've done this technique before, but if yours keeps popping up on you and that crease is not staying, then you can set a book or something like that on top of it to help it lay flat while it cools. Okay, other side. And again, I'm just folding that raw edge in to meet right at the center where we put that original crease. I'm gonna grab something. There we go. Tissue box is the closest thing I've got near me, but I'm gonna set that on top. Let that cool flat while I finish ironing this last portion. Okay, now coming back to the beginning, we're going to fold it down that original crease one more time. So I've got this with my raw edges meeting in the center. I'm just gonna fold it down that original crease line that we made and press it one last time. So my edges, the top and the bottom edges should both be a 1/4 inch wide. The folded sides here should be even. And that's important for when we go to stitch it on, because if they are not even, then one side may not get fully caught. Okay, and I'm gonna grab my pins and I'm gonna pin this to itself to help it stay shut as it cools. Ooh, it's very warm. Okay, so I'm gonna let that cool while it's shut for a second. And while I let that cool, I'm gonna go ahead and grab my garment. At center front, you should have a little notch. So mine, let's see where center front is. My little notch is so small, it's not really showing up. I'm gonna snip it a little bit bigger so you can see it. This needs to be a very small notch because your seam is only going to be a 1/4 inch. A 1/4 inch. And so you don't want to snip too far past that 1/4 inch to where it's going to be making a hole into your garment. But that center front, you should have a notch on your pattern that you snipped into. We're going to fold our bias strip in half and find the center of our bias strip so that we can line it up with that notch. So I just folded mine in half. I'm going to put a little pin where that halfway point is. So now when I'm putting this on my garment, I have that reference for the center. Okay, once this is cool, you can go ahead and take your pins out for now. And we're gonna start pinning this onto our garment. So right at that center, I'm gonna match that up. And I want my neckline to go all the way, the raw edge of my neckline to go all the way up into that crease. Okay, and then pin that on. And I'm gonna get a little bit closer so y'all can see. Okay, so there's my center front. The next reference point I'm going to do is either end of the strip, and then we'll go pin the in-between areas. So here I've got one end of my back. I'm gonna put the end of my strip right there. I don't want these little frayed corners sticking out of my bias strip, so you can kind of tuck those in so they're hidden. but the edge of your strip should hit right at the edge of your back. And then I'll go ahead and pin that one too. And now the other end. So we want to get these 3 reference points pinned first, and then we'll pin the in-between. Okay. So now I've got this in-between area. That's my center front. This is my back. I need to use the stretch of my bias strip to help my bias strip curve to that curve of the neckline. Okay, so that's why we cut this on the bias, because that stretch that is inherent in the bias strip helps it form to that curve. Tucking my neckline all the way into that bias strip as far as I can get. So you want this to lay flat all the way around the neckline. And what I mean by that, excuse me, is that right where that neckline meets the edge of the bias strip, you should have a flat area. Obviously, this is going to be a 3D circle that goes around the neck. So you can see just after that bias strip, my garment starts to pick up away from the table. That is normal. But what I don't want are any little tucks. So if you can see right here where it's starting to form a tuck, that is not what I want. I want to flatten that out before I pin it down so that I don't, right on that edge of the bias strip, I don't have any tucks where the fabric is folding over on itself. This pinning part is usually a bit tedious, but it's one of the most important parts as you're putting this bias strip on, because it's going to make sewing it so much easier if you've pinned it accurately. Okay, whoops, I guess I twisted my bias strip around when I was pinning this one. Let's get it untwisted. Pin that back on. There we go. And then same thing on this half. I'm just going to work on getting my neckline all the way up into that crease as far as it will go and pinning. And now we are going to stitch on our bias strip. So I'm going to line this up and put my needle down first on that inside corner on this left-hand side of the screen. This is supposed to be an edge stitch, so we're going to get as close to that edge as possible. Put that down. You know what, before I do that, I'm going to make sure that my bottom is getting caught. Okay. Then foot down afterwards, and now we can begin stitching. You may have a little bit of bulk right at the beginning that your machine doesn't want to get over. So what I have to do sometimes is just manually scoot it back for a stitch or two until it gets over that hump. These are your 4 stitches. There we go. So now it got over the hump and it is moving along on its own. And then we're just going to continue along doing an edge stitch along that inside edge. As you go and you remove your pins, make sure that your garment does not start to pull away from your bias strip, because then you won't catch the actual neckline of your garment. So every time you pull out a pin, double check that your garment is still pushed into that bias strip as far as it will go. So there is my edge stitch going all along the outside edge, and then it should be catching the inside of your strip as well and doing an edge stitch along there. Okay. Okay, so if your full bias strip was not caught on the outside and inside, then you may have to take that out and redo that step. Okay, let's go ahead and move along to our sleeves. The last part is just trimming up those threads, any threads that you have hanging off. Make sure those get trimmed, and then we'll move on to our sleeve. Okay, set that aside and grab your sleeve pattern. So that is this one. And so on it is it's named sleeve, and this one was a cut too, so you should have 2 of these in total. And what we're going to do is take that 1/4 inch seam allowance that we have out here on the outside edge of that ruffle, and we're going to hem that before we put it onto our garment. So just like we did on our sample for our notebook for the narrow or the rolled hem, we're going to do that same thing on this curved edge of our sleeve. So the first step is to create that 1/8 inch basting guide for whenever we go to press it. So I'm going to do one sleeve during the video today just to save time, but you will do the exact same steps to both sleeves. Okay, so take our sleeve, we're going to take it over to our machine, and we're going to do that 1/8 inch basting. Okay, over here, push your stitch length from a 2.5 up to a 4.0 for the basting stitch. And then we're going to line up our curved edge of our sleeve with that 1/8 inch marking on your foot. No need to back stitch for a basting. And then we'll just follow along 1/8 of an inch away from our raw edge to create our guide. So there's my 1/8 inch guide. And now I'm going to take this over to my ironing board to press up my hem. So starting on one end, I'm looking at the back of my fabric, the wrong side of my fabric. I'm going to fold up that first 1/8 of an inch that we just basted and press it. And again, this is on a curve. So it is a partial bias. It's not a true bias, 45-degree angle, but it is at an angle, more, what is it? Just a less steep angle. And so there is some stretch. So be careful as you're pressing not to pull on this too much so that it doesn't stretch out the edge of your fabric. So just like we did with our bias strip, we'll lift up our iron every time we move it, and we won't pull our fingers along the fabric. Okay, and then one more time, we're going to fold that up to hide that raw edge. So another 1/8 of an inch. We use that raw edge as our guide and fold it right where that raw edge is hitting. So this should be a very narrow hem. Okay, and then I'm just going to transfer my pins to the outside of the sleeve because we're about to stitch this down at an 1/8 of an inch, but we want to do it from the front side of the sleeve so that we can make sure it's nice and even with our folded edge. So I'm going to transfer all of these pins just to the outside. Okay, now we're going to do an 1/8 of an inch stitch to secure that down. So again, from the front side, we are stitching this. Line up that folded edge with your 1/8 of an inch marking, and then we'll do a permanent stitch. So if you haven't already turned down your stitch length from the basting, we need to turn it back down to a 2.5. And now we can start stitching with our back stitch. And then just do a permanent stitch following along that edge at an 1/8 of an inch. So that is our finished hem for our sleeve. So from the outside, you've got that 1/8 of an inch even, and then from the inside, it should be catching that full seam. The last step is just to go in and take out that basting stitch that's visible on the folded edge. Okay, and then also trim up your threads, of course. So you'll do that to both sleeves, and that's where we're going to stop today.